Welcome to Medieval India, Episode 4, Slave Kings of Delhi. Aibak's death was followed by disorder and revolt among both Muslims and Hindus, and in 1211 the Muslim nobles offered the throne to Shams-ud-Din Iltutmish. He was the son-in-law of Aibak, the most outstanding of his slaves, and a member of a leading family of the Ibari tribe of Turkmens from present Kazakhstan. The listener will already have noted that in medieval Islam, enslavement did not lead or have to lead to a permanent position of inferiority, as was the case in the Americas. Just like in the Roman Empire, slaves or ex-slaves could make considerable careers, though amongst the Romans the permanent stigma of slave origins prohibited them to ascend to elite positions, as was not unusual in Islam. The chronicle says about the descent of Iltutmish, quote, "The future monarch was from his childhood on remarkable for his beauty, his intelligence, and his grace. It was such as to excite jealousy in the heart of his brothers. So they enticed him away from his father and mother with the pretext of going to see a drove of horses. Some say he was then sold by his cousins. The horse dealers took him to Bukhara, and they sold him to one of the relatives of the chief judge of that city. He in turn sold him on to another merchant named Jain-ud-Din Chast-Kaba, who brought him to Ghazni. No Turk equal to him in beauty, virtue, intelligence, and nobleness had at that time ever been brought to that city. Mention of him was then made before His Majesty, Sultan Muiz-ud-Din Muhammad Shams, who ordered a price should be named for him." End quote. While the Turks and the Pathan chiefs had assembled from all quarters in the new capital of Delhi to celebrate the proclamation of Iltutmish to Shah-in-Shah, the chronicle then goes on to say that, quote, "The chiefs of that city, Delhi, did not join them. They resolved to try the effects of resistance, so they went out of Delhi. They collected in the surroundings and they raised the standard of revolt. Sultan Shams-ud-Din then marched out of Delhi with a body of horse and his own personal followers, and he defeated them in the plains of the Jamuna and put most of their horsemen to the sword and to flight. Afterwards, Sultan Taj-ud-Din of Ghazni made a treaty with him from Lahore, and he sent him some insignia of royalty." End quote. But meanwhile, the successor of Ikhtiyar-ud-Din as governor of Bengal, Ali Mardan Khan, had declared himself independent, and the Ghuri viceroy Kabak Shah seemed intent, besides retaining his independence in Multan and Sindh, to extend his authority over Lahore and the upper Punjab as well. Taj-ud-Din Jildis, meanwhile, who held Ghazni, pretended, as Muhammad Ghori's successor to the suzerainty over all the Indian conquest of Ghor, to assert his claims by only issuing to Iltutmish the commission of viceroy. The position of Iltutmish was initially indeed so precarious that he did not dare to avenge that insulting behavior of Jildis. He, however, neither forgot nor forgave it. Many of the Turkish nobles, even the ones in Hindustan, chafed at his authority, and he was for most of his rule occupied in establishing it in the districts of Delhi, Balban, Awadh and Benares, and in the sub-montane tracts of the Himalaya. It took a full 17 years for Iltutmish to reduce to order a kingdom that he had found in utter confusion. Even in its heart, the Ganga-Jamuna tract, Iltutmish had to launch military operations against rebels whose successful termination he was not destined to see. In the districts north of the Ganga, round Badaun, Farrukhabad and Barai, numerous Hindu chiefs had founded strongholds against the Muslim outposts in the Doab. In Anola, the Kateria Rajputs had built a stronghold, and they not only blocked Turkish expeditions across the Ganga, but encroached even on the territory of Awadh, which area by itself harbored not a few resisting chiefs as well. The inclusion by Iltutmish chronicler of Badaun, Kannauj and even of Benares among the new conquests can be understood only in that context, for these places had all already figured amongst Aibak's initial conquests. Some idea of the nature of the fighting in these areas may be formed from a reference to Prince Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud waging continuous holy wars against refractory Hindu tribes, and to a reference in the chronicle that he had to overthrow a chief, quote, named Bartu, beneath whose sword 120,000 good Muslims had attained martyrdom. The Delhi, which the armies of Qutb-ud-Din Aibak had occupied in 1191, was the Qala-i-Raish, the oldest of the 7 cities of Delhi, located at the present suburb of Merauli. Within its perimeter was included the strongly fortified citadel known as the Lal Kot, and inside the fortress the conquerors erected a gorgeous palace of which little has survived, and one of the most remarkable group of monuments of which Islam can boast, the Qutb Minar complex. Its nucleus is the Jami or Kuwat al-Islam mosque that was founded in 1191 by Qutb-ud-Din Aibak to commemorate the capture of Delhi, and that is dedicated, as its name implies, to the might of Islam. Raised on a lofty plinth and approached through gateways set in 3 of its sides, its plan is typical of the majority of mosques everywhere. It consists, that is to say, of an open quadrangle enclosed by colonnades, of which the western one constitutes the prayer chamber. Seen from within or seen from without, the building, as originally designed, presented an essentially Hindu appearance. Half of the plinth on which it stood had actually been the basement of a Hindu temple, and the rest of the structure's walls, columns, capitals, architraves and ceilings were composed of materials that were stripped from the shrines of the unbelievers, 21 of which, so one of the inscriptions in the building informs us, had gone into the making of this mosque. Indeed, save for the prayer niche, the mihrab, in the back wall, there was scarcely any feature in the whole Kuwat al-Islam building to indicate its Muslim character. The Qutb Minar, the adjacent tower, seems to have been intended as a minaret from which of course the muezzin can summon the faithful to prayer, though it soon came to be seen as a tower of victory, akin to those afterwards erected by a Hindu king at Chittor in Rajasthan and a Muslim one at Mandu in Madhya Pradesh. As originally designed, it stood some 225 feet in height, and it comprised 4 stories divided from one another by richly decorated balconies and further embellished by vertical flutings and horizontal bands of inscriptions that were interwoven with designs of flowers. Only a portion of the first story was completed in the time of Qutbuddin Aybak, and the rest was completed by Iltutmish. In an inscription on the lowest band of the first story, Qutb-ud-Din is referred to under his usual vice-regal title of the Amir, commander of the army, the glorious, the great, and on the adjacent bands are eulogies of his overlord Muiz-ud-Din Muhammad Ghuri and of the latter brother Ghiyas-ud-Din. Nothing, certainly, could be a more imposing or a more fitting symbol of Muslim power than this stern but stupendous tower, nor could anything be more exquisite than its rich but restrained carvings. At the time the Qutb Minar was being finished, and at the time Iltutmish fought to retain and reobtain his kingdom, to add to his woes, the formidable Jangiz Khan, then in the middle of his merciless conquests, which ravaged northern China and Central Asia, descended on the western Punjab in 1221. His troops were pursuing the son of the fugitive ruler of Khwarizm, Muhammad Shah Jalal-ud-Din, whose empire Jangiz Khan had just destroyed. The chronicle Tabakat-i-Nasiri, which admires any Muslim slayer of men, yet abhors such a heathen one as Jangiz Khan, has drawn a memorable sketch of Jangiz Khan. It is worth quoting, as his descendants would later on rule India for 400 years. Quote, trustworthy persons have related that Jangiz Khan, at the time when he came into Khorasan, was 65 years old. He was a man of tall stature, of vigorous build, robust in body, the hair on his face scanty and turned white, with cat's eyes. He was possessed of great energy, discernment, genius and understanding. He was awe-striking too, a butcher, but a just and resolute ruler. He was an overthrower of enemies. He was intrepid, sanguinary and cruel. End quote. Jangiz Khan was also reported by the chronicle to be an adept in magic, and he was befriended by demons. He would sometimes fall into a trance, and then he would utter oracles dictated by devils who possessed him, all according to the Tabakat-i-Nasiri, though this was of course common practice in the Mongolian shamanist religion. The chronicler Rashid-ud-Din writes, one of the inhabitants who had fled from Khorasan to the Punjab with the suit of Sultan Jalal-ud-Din after Jangiz Khan's coming, and when Jangiz Khan was done in Khorasan, said, they inquired him about the present state of Bukhara. He replied, the Mongols came, the Mongols dug, the Mongols burned, the Mongols slaughtered, the Mongols plundered, and the Mongols departed again. A knot of learned men who had heard him say that unanimously declared that it would be impossible to express more accurately and more concisely in Persian what had just happened. End quote. In the cities of the Punjab, Jangiz Khan ordered all the inhabitants to be brought out into the plain and counted. And after selecting men who had useful skills to take them to Mongolia, all the rest were slain. The Mongols had as little problems filling their required dozens of bags with severed heads in the Punjab as they had elsewhere. The number of casualties of the Mongols, given in reliable contemporary texts, run in the millions. Figures of casualties of war that are not equaled again until the coming of the 20th century. However, luckily for the inhabitants of northern India, the Mongols then retired back to Afghanistan. Jangiz Khan had admittedly considered returning, or given his common methods, rather to cut a bloody swath to Mongolia by way of Bengal and of Assam. But the difficulties of that route were such that he was forced to turn back after travelling only the first 2 or 3 stages of hundreds. The reason for him expediting his return to Mongolia, besides, Rashid-ud-Din further specifies, was that he had received intelligence that the Mongolian tribes of the Khitan and the Tangut exhibited signs of disaffection with Jangiz Khan's prolonged absence from Mongolia, and he had to rapidly return there to bring them to obedience. He died while the campaign against the Tanguts was still in progress on 25 August 1227. The former Sultan of Khwarizm, Jalal-ud-Din, remained in Dindia for nearly 3 years. He was joined on the banks of the Indus by stragglers from his defeated armies, and after several successful encounters with bodies of Indian troops in the salt ranges, he found himself at the head of some 3,000 to 4,000 well-armed men. News of the approach of a pursuing Mongol army then caused him to withdraw in the direction of Delhi. But somewhere in the Rawalpindi area, the Mongols gave up the chase, and Jalal-ud-Din, after having arrived within a 2 or 3 days' march to Delhi, dispatched an envoy to Iltutmish to beseech him for an alliance and to ask for temporary asylum. Alarmed at the possibility of getting involved with Jalal-ud-Din, and with it risk incurring the Mongol wrath, Iltutmish replied with a mere polite refusal. Jalal-ud-Din then established himself in Sindh. But while he was at Daibul, he received the news that his brother Ghiyat al-Din had made himself master of Iraq, where, however, the greater part of the military favored Jalal-ad-Din, and they were demanding his presence there. That news and reports of the Mongols starting his search for him again moved the Sultan to re-enter Persia by way of Baluchistan and Makran. While Iltutmish was thus establishing the rule of Delhi from the Indus to the mouth of the Ganga, A new power was rising in his very capital, which was to dominate all his successors and who were to become the kingmakers for the next 40 years. The Turkish slaves of the court had organized themselves into a conclave known as the 40, and ousting the free nobility from the more important offices, they gradually cut the reins of government into their own hands. In 1236, when Iltutmish, the greatest of the slave kings, lay dying, he nominated his daughter Razzya to succeed him, remarking with prophetic insight that Razzya was more a man than any of her male brothers. On the death of Iltutmish, the princes and nobles, however, placed her brother Rukn-ud-Din upon the throne in March 1236. Immediately after, he parted to his palace in the countryside from Delhi. And then, says the chronicle, quote, the new monarch opened the doors of his treasury and he gave himself up to pleasure and to squandering the public wealth in improper places. He was so entirely devoted to riot and debauchery that he would often bestow honors and rewards on bands of singers, on buffoons and on catamites, that is boys used for homosexual acts. He scattered his riches to such a heedless extent that he would ride out drunk upon an elephant through the streets and the bazaars of Delhi. And there he would throw tanka coins of gold round him for the people to pick up and rejoice over. He was also very fond of playing with and riding upon elephants, and all the elephant drivers in the country were much benefited by his bounty that he bestowed on them. His nature was averse to hurting any creature, and his tenderness would be the ultimate cause of his downfall. For his mother, Shah Turkan, began to interfere ever more in the running of the kingdom. During the life of Iltutmish, the other woman of the harem had looked upon her with envy and disdain. She now seized the opportunity of punishing them in blind fury and vindictiveness, and she put several of them to a cruel death. All this was accompanied by internal troubles and an invasion from Ghazni, which penetrated up to Multan. In the month of November 1236, Razzya quarrelled with the mother of the Sultan Rukn-ud-Din, and the Sultan was forced to return to Delhi from his pleasure palace. His mother now attempted to seize and kill Razzya, but the people of Delhi rose up as they heard rumors of that, and Razzya seized the royal palace and made the mother of the Sultan a prisoner instead. As Rukn-ud-Din arrived at Kilokari, the royal residence just outside of Delhi, he found that a rebellion had broken out in the city and that his mother had been made a captive. The Kars and the Turkish nobles he had sent to Delhi, as they arrived there, and as they witnessed the mood of the crowd, joined Razzya. They proffered their allegiance to her, and they raised her to the throne. Being thus elevated to the position of Shah-in-Shah, she sent an army of Turks and nobles to Kilokari, and they brought Sultan Rukn-ud-Din as a prisoner to Delhi, where he was kept in close confinement and died within a few months. Razzya, the chronicler comments on her, was a great sovereign, sagacious, just, beneficent, and a dispenser of justice and of warlike talent. She was endowed with all the admirable attributes and qualifications that are necessary for kings. But though she possessed all such qualities, she was not born of the right sex, and so in the estimation of man, all these virtues were worthless all the same. End quote. For 3 years, Razzya held her own, partly by cunning and partly by diplomacy, as when, in the beginning of her reign, she was threatened by an overwhelming coalition of rebels, led by the governors of Multan and Lahore. This league she accomplished to root out by seeding mutual distrust between the two leaders, so that finally both appealed to her for help against the other, and she could destroy both separately. She proved her ability to rule on the battlefield as well. There she accompanied her troops not merely on field, but dressed in the coat of armor of a man while she was mounted on an elephant. But Razzya made one big mistake, and it would cost her her throne and her life. Instead of relying entirely on the 40 for her choice of grandees and for the allotment of fiefs, she affronted the 40 when she chose as her chief counselor not one of them, but rather an African ex-slave by the name of Yakut. Inevitably, probably unfounded rumors went round he was her lover. Even the chronicler, much devoted to upholding decorum, sneered, "How can we even reconcile the inconsistency of a queen of such a vast territory fixing her attention on so unworthy an object?" And we can only guess at all the salacious rumors that were going round on the bazaar. Some listeners may know Razzya's putative romance with Yakut was inevitably the topic of an Indian soap series recently, though Yakut was white in that series. The jealous and infuriated 40 then raised a banner of rebellion, as the chroniclers say, and the leader of the rebellion, Ikhtiyar-ud-Din al-Tunya, defeated the royal troops and took the queen prisoner, and he made her half-brother Bahram king in 1240. But Razzya was not yet at her wit's end. She married her captor al-Tunya instead, and at the head of a large army she marched on Delhi to win back her throne. But the fates were against her. Bahram's army routed her forces, and Razzya was a few days after killed by a thug for the rich clothes she was wearing while she slept worn out in a forest alone. Bahram, after a merely nominal rule of 2 years, quarreled with his masters, the 40, in turn, and he was put to death. The most important event in his brief reign was a Mongol raid at the end of 1241, in which Lahore was taken and ransacked. Alauddin Masud, the grandson of Iltutmish, who came to the throne in 1242, succeeded to a kingdom which was rapidly shorn of all the territory that Iltutmish had conquered with so much troubles before. Sindh, Multan, the Upper Punjab, Bengal and Bihar were all lost. As he was indolent, a drunkard, and unbalanced in his unpredictable bouts of ire, the 40 decided in 1246 to make his uncle Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud king in his place. Alauddin Masud was murdered, and Nasir-ud-Din, who was then a youth of 17, succeeded him. Nasir-ud-Din proved to be a mild, kind, and devout king, and he passed most of his time making copies of the Holy Book, a highly meritorious act in Islam, rather than passing his time ruling. Says the chronicler of him, quote, "Contrary to the customs of other princes, he had no concubines. He had only one wife, whom he obliged to do every homely chore of housewifery. When she complained one day that she had burned her fingers baking his bread, and desired he would allow her a maid to assist her, he rejected it, saying he was only a trustee of the state, and therefore determined not to burden the state with useless expenses." End quote. During the 20 years of his rather uneventful reign, Balban was the deputy of the state, and he bore the title of Ulugh Khan. During the later years of Nasir-ud-Din's reign, he had become merely a puppet of Balban, who carried on the actual government. And even while he was only a Khan, that is no more than a ranking noble, Balban already used many of the insignia of royalty. Balban had earlier been the most senior and the most outstanding member of the 40, and he hailed from Central Asia, where his father had been a ruling chief. But Balban, the slave, was to rise to far greater heights than the chieftainship of some obscure Turkmenian clan. Within 2 years, Balban, the regent, had reduced the unruly Hindu chiefs of the Punjab to order, he had repelled a Mongol raid, and he had reasserted the authority of the central government amongst the turbulent Hindus of the Doab. As we saw in the previous episode, that was the region from which the revenues of the kingdom largely derived. He was created a lieutenant of the kingdom in 1249 after the marriage of his daughter to Sultan Nasir-ud-Din. Balban was by 1252 the most powerful man in northern India, and the other 40 then began to plot his downfall. In 1253 Balban was briefly banished to his fief of Nagaur, but the other 40 eventually repented of their deed, and he was recalled 18 months later and reinstated in his former position of lieutenant of the kingdom. From then onward, Balban held the Delhi Sultanate together by his energy and by the ruthlessness of his campaigns. And when Nasir-ud-Din, the last of the male descendants of Iltutmish, died in 1266, he became king as Ghiyas-ud-Din Balban. In the 30 years after Iltutmish, during the reign of his sons and daughter, the affairs of the country had fallen into confusion. Through the youth and the sensuality of his immediate successors, and the brief span of rule of Razzya, and through the mildness and humility of Sultan Nasir-ud-Din, the treasury was empty, and the royal court had but little in the way of wealth or the flocks of horses required for a powerful army. The Turkish slaves of the 40 had become the lords of the kingdom instead, and they had divided amongst them all its estates and fiefdoms, so that the whole country was now under their control. For the Muslims, who were almost immeasurably outnumbered by the Hindu peasants, kept their hold on the country only by means of garrisons that were scattered across the countryside, while their great fiefs were scattered over the countryside as well, so as to provide the local governors the means to raise troops, or so as to hold the Rajput chiefs and landholders at bay and keep the northwestern marches under control as well. but there was still lingering resistance of Hindus everywhere. Even in the direct neighborhood of Delhi, there were extensive and dense jungles that were entirely territory owned by rebels, not under the control of the government, and gradually settled by Jat soldier colonists who were to remain a problem for governments for centuries. As the main roads to the south from the capital passed through that tract. And often, thus the chronicler, quote, the disaffected of the Dohab and the outlaws might grow bold, and then they might take to robbery on the highway, and they so beset the roads that caravans and merchants were unable to pass. The daring of the Mewatis in the neighborhood of Delhi was carried to such an extent that the western gates of the city were shut at afternoon prayer, and no one dared to go south of Delhi after that hour, whether he traveled as a pilgrim, that is without carrying any valuables, or with all the display of a sovereign. At afternoon prayer, the Mewatis would even come to the Sar house, that is the great water tank just outside of Delhi, and assault the water carriers and the girls who were fetching water. They would strip them there and carry off their clothes. With much of the country in resistance, Balban could only bring the territories under control by a veritable reign of terror. For, as the chronicler Barney pointed out in his tract on kinship, the Fatawa-i-Jahadiri, kinship rests on two pillars, mercy and terrorism, but both are out of reach of a miserly and weak-willed king. Terrorism, that is to instill fear in the subjects, is both a necessity and a prerogative for a strong king. Without calculated deeds of fearfulness, respect for the ruler will rapidly wither away. Here, of course, the key word is calculated. Violence of which crowds and nobles alike do not see the point will equally erode respect, as we saw with Rukn-ud-Din's rivalry with Razzya. And Balban, of whom the chronicler Frista reports a couple of wise words as emblematic mottos for the good ruler, said himself in one of his wise sayings, quote, never attempt anything but through necessity, and when you are certain to accomplish it. It is better for a king to be obstinate than to be hesitant. In the first case, the king may be right, but in the second case, he is sure to be wrong. End quote. Even while Delhi was thus still under the nominal control of the mild Mahmud, Balban had crossed the Mewati rebels, at least some of them for some time, with horrible ferocity. He had massacred the more fortunate men, women and children by the thousands, and he had publicly put 250 of their leaders to death by being trampled on by elephants, by being slowly sliced up into pieces, or by being flayed alive. That means that your skin is being torn off. As king, he was ready to hang an unsuccessful general to encourage the remaining military leaders, and he did not hesitate to inflict the most terrible punishments as deterrents to his enemies and to persons who would revolt against him. It was, after all, his life or theirs, and he succeeded in this way in holding his unruly realm together until he peacefully passed away at the age of 82. He relied on the swiftness of his forced marches when quelling a revolt, and he kept order by the establishment of forts at important points. And he counted too in his internal administration on an army of spies who were independent of the local governor. Wise men of the age held too that the prime duty of the king was to assume the dignity of his proper station while never forgetting the majesty of God and the king's duties to his subjects. And therefore the chronicle says that, quote, from the first and second year of his reign on, Balban assumed an ever greater state, and he made great display of his pomp and dignity. Muslims and Hindus alike would come over vast distances to see the splendor of his equipage, which filled them with amazement. No sovereign had ever before exhibited such pomp and grandeur in Delhi. When the Sultan rode out in a procession, any suppliant could draw his attention by holding up a petition in his hands or crying aloud for his protection. Certain of his attendants who waited on him in private assured they never saw him otherwise than fully dressed. During the whole time that he was a Khan, and the time he was a Sultan, which extended over nearly 40 years, he never conversed with persons of low origin or occupation, and he never indulged in any kind of familiarity either with friends or with strangers, by which the dignity of the sovereign could be lowered. He never joked with anyone too, nor did he allow anyone to make jokes in his presence. He never laughed aloud, nor did he permit anyone in his court to laugh loud. In the administration of justice he was inflexible, showing no favor to his brethren, or his children, or his associates, or his attendants, and if any of them committed an act of injustice, he never failed to give redress and comfort to the injured person. No man dared to be too severe to his slaves or handmaids, to his horsemen or his footmen. End quote. All this was, of course, pretty much the behavior that the Kabulsname prescribed as the proper behavior of a king, as we saw in the previous episode. The chronicler then goes on to give an example of Balban's strivings to elevate the king above his unruly nobles as much as above his ordinary subjects. Quote, Malik Baibak, father of Malik Kir Bek, who was a slave of Sultan Balban, was Tsar Jahandar and one of the most privileged attendants of the court. He held the Jakir, that is a joint administrative and military position tied to a piece of land, of 4,000 horses, and the Iqta of Badaun. In a fit of drunkenness, while at Badaun, he had caused one of his domestic attendants to be beaten to death with scourges. Sometimes afterwards, the Sultan went to Badaun, and the man's widow complained to the Sultan. He immediately ordered that this Malik Baibak, chief of Badaun, should be scourged to death in the presence of the widow in retaliation. The spies who had been stationed to watch the fief of Badaun and had made no report of those doings were hanged over the gate of the town. This is, of course, what was meant with a calculated deed of terror, as it served to inspire fear in others. Balban also introduced the strictest ceremonial in his court, in which, according to the old maximes of the Persian kings of yore, and indeed of the Babylonian ones before them, the persons allowed an audience would have to kiss the ground, and the Sultan sat motionless, merely addressing the supplicant by way of a herald. For Balban himself counselled, quote, When you ascend the throne, you should consider yourself the deputy of God. Have a just sense of the importance of your charge. Permit not any meanness of behavior in yourself to sully the luster of your station, and do not let avaricious and low-minded men share your esteem or bear any part of your administration. The Delhi court of Balban's time worked as follows. The general audience was the occasion for the persecuted and the needy to claim the Sultan's protection. It was in these public darbars too that the monarch discharged the formal duties appertaining to his office. Matters requiring discussion and deliberation or involving secrets were dealt with in the closed council chambers, where only those officers were admitted whose advice was immediately required. The private audience was less exclusive than the secret council, and it was attended by the greater nobles and the officers of the state. The most important members of the secretariat were also in attendance. The bulk of the state's business was transacted in this public darbar by the Sultan. The arrangements and the ceremonials of the court of the Delhi Sultanate differed widely from those later on in sway in the Mughal Empire of Emperor Akbar and his successors, as we shall see later. In the Mughal Empire, the religious scholars and judges were not very much present, but Balban instructed future kings, quote, "Let the worship of God be inculcated by your example." Each ceremonial in court was therefore began with the cry Allahu Akbar, and the precedence in the order of ranking of the court was given to the ulama, the Quran scholars, and to the sayyids, or the holy men. The interior of the Sultan's palace, in the Qala-i-Rais, was approached by 3 gates in succession. Outside the first gate were the platforms on which the executioners sat. The persons condemned were executed outside the gate of the palace, where their bodies lay exposed for 3 days. The remains were then collected and thrown into a pit near the huts of the executioners, who are of course outcasts in almost every society. And they were then thrown. The relatives were not allowed to give the victims a decent burial, if they were Muslims clearly. But they sometimes managed to obtain the body by bribery all the same. The approaches of the palace were thus often blocked by heaps of mangled corpses. Lest, however, this be constructed as typical Oriental cruelty and despotism, supposedly so much opposed to the British good governance and fair justice, so that colonial historians always love to dwell on such horrible details. It be added to this that any European city at the same time was then also approached by passing through rows of gibbets. The second gate opened on a spacious audience hall for the general public. The scribes of the gate sat at the third portal, which could not be passed without the direct authorization of the Sultan, who gave his formal audiences beyond this portal in the so-called Hall of 1,000 Columns. The columns there were of varnished wood, and the ceiling was of planks that were admirably painted in flowery motifs. The formal audience usually was given after prayers in the afternoon, but sometimes it took place at daybreak. The order of precedence in ranking and in the presentation at the court was first the chief Qadi, or the judge of Islamic law, then the chief preacher, then the other qadis, then the leading Sharia lawyers, then the principal descendants of the Prophet, then the sheikhs or holy men, then the relatives of the sultan, if he had no son, then the principal nobles, then the foreign notables, and then the generals. A special ceremonial was observed on the occasion of the two great Eid festivals, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Qurban. On those celebrations there was set up a great perfume holder made of pure gold in sections, each of which required several men to carry it. Inside it were 3 niches or compartments occupied by men whose business it was to diffuse incense from the burning of 2 kinds of aloe woods, with ambergris and benzoin. The whole audience hall was then filled with the vapor, and boys carrying gold and silver barrels of rose water and orange water sprinkled the contents free over all the persons present. With all his strivings to assert and strengthen the royal authority throughout his reign, Balban had still to put down incessant Hindu disaffection and the rebellions of ambitious Muslim nobles. In 1217, Balban had re-established the provincial government of Lahore, and in 1280 he put down a formidable rebellion in Bengal. The governor of Bengal, Tughril Beg, was executed, and his family and adherents impaled on rows of stakes along the 2 miles of the main street of Lakhnavati, the administrative capital. As said, terror was indispensable, lest the king's authority was questioned everywhere. Balban then made one of his sons, Bukhra Khan, governor of Bengal. Barni relates of Balban, quote, "The intimate friends of the Sultan, such as Aidil Khan, Tabar Khan and other members of the Old 40 who, through the protection of the Sultan, occupied exalted positions, still often said to him, 'Sovereigns like Qutb-ud-Din Aibak and Shams-ud-Din, our former patrons, conquered distant countries, and they carried off treasures and valuables and elephants and horses from the Rajas. How is it that with your better equipped and disciplined army, they would then say, you do not undertake any such distant campaigns and never move out of your territory to other regions?' Balban then replied, 'The thoughts which you have expressed have also been very active in my mind, but you have not considered the hordes of Jangiz Khan and the evil they have brought upon the women and the children, the flocks and the herds on my frontier. These Mongols have now established themselves in Ghazni, in Tirmiz and in Mawaranar. Hulaku, the grandson of Jangiz Khan, with his vast horde, has even subdued Iraq, and he has occupied Baghdad. For on 20 February 1258, the last caliph, Mutasim, was rolled up in a carpet and trampled or kicked to death to avoid the shedding of blood, such being the Mongols' choice method of executing their own princes. It was a critical moment in the history of Islam, since from then on Islam lacked any generally recognized central authority, a caliph like before. No Sultan of Delhi would ever try to assert himself as the only sovereign ruler of the faithful, and Sultan Alauddin would later on recognize the rulers of Egypt as caliphs instead. Balban then pursued, quote, "Those accursed Mongol wretches have heard of the wealth and prosperity of Hindustan, and they have set their hearts upon conquering and plundering it. They have taken and sacked Lahore within my territories, and not a year passes that they do not come here and plunder my villages. They watch the first opportunity of my departure on a distant campaign to enter my cities and to ravage them. They even talk about the conquest and the sack of Delhi. I have devoted all the revenues of my kingdom to the equipment of my army, and I hold all my forces ready and prepared to receive them. I never leave my kingdom, nor will I go any distance from it. In the reigns of my patrons and predecessors, there were none of such difficulties with the Mongols. In their time, they could lead their armies wherever they pleased, subdue the dominions of the Hindus, and carry off gold and treasures, while they could stay away from their capital for a year or two. If this anxiety which admonishes me that I am the guardian and protector of all Muslims were removed, then I would not stay even one day in my capital, but I would lead forth my army to capture treasure and valuables, elephants and horses, and I would never allow the Hindus and the Razzas to repose in quiet at a distance, even for one moment. End quote. Balban's number one priority throughout his reign was thus to organize the defense of his frontier against the ever-present danger of a major Mongol invasion. And his priority too was to seal off the northwestern frontier against Mongol raids. The traveler Ibn Battuta mentions an Arabic inscription of Tughlaq on the Friday Mosque of Multan, which ran as follows: I have encountered the Tartars on 29 occasions, and I defeated them there. Hence I am called Malik al-Ghazi, the king of the warriors of the faith. From this inscription it emerges clearly there was hardly any peace along the 1,000 miles long frontier of the Sultanate of Delhi with the Ilkhans in Persia. And there was constant small-scale fighting on the Khyber Pass that is not narrated in the chronicles, where only the major inroads are mentioned. And constant watchfulness from the most remote post in the Hindu Kush to Delhi was necessary, lest the defenses of one place caved in and the Mongols would then flood into the North Indian plains. To halt the Mongols, Balban gave his cousin Sher Khan command of a large and lavishly equipped army consisting of highly skilled horse archers who were recruited from Khwarizm, and he constructed fortresses at strategic points to bar the Mongols the way to Delhi. Balban also cut roads through the jungle to the west of Delhi to tame the ever unruly hill tribes, the Kakars, with whom Mahmud of Ghazni had already struggled. Mongol incursions during his reign met with no success, therefore, but in 1285 Balban experienced the greatest sorrow of his long life when his promising son and inheritor, Muhammad Khan, was killed in action against the Mongol invasion of Multan. It must be seen as Balban's great historical achievement that he was the only leader in Eurasia at the time to have actually held back a Mongol invasion of one of the most tempting targets, the rich North Indian plains, at the very time the Mongols reached the summit of their power on the Great Khan Kubilai, at the time, that is, that the Mongols did defeat mighty Sung China, the most populous and most technologically advanced society of the 13th century's world, that they invaded Vietnam, that they overran Korea, and famously even attempted to invade Japan. It was at the time too that Russia was under the Mongol yoke, that Hungary had collapsed after a Mongol invasion in 1241 and that only Mamluk Egypt, at the other outmost reach of the Mongol power, managed to push them back at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. Balban died in 1287. The short, unprepossessing slave who had risen from one-time water carrier to huntsman, from huntsman to general and statesman, and then on to the supreme power in a great medieval power, had held his kingdom together and had saved it from the great calamity of a Mongol invasion. However, most of India was still under Hindu kings, and they were only to experience the might of the Delhi Sultanate under the next kings of the Khalji dynasty, with whom we shall deal in the next episode.